on LinkedIn Live. That's where the active chat is. Hello, good afternoon, LinkedIn Live. Welcome to the seventh and final webinar in this particular series. And so we've been taking a journey through my new book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence. And so as you may recall, we've had webinars on sort of the origin of the book. Where did the book come from? Why did I write this book? And of course, I've been studying leadership development formally for more than 20 years and informally for much longer than that. And once I finally allowed myself the freedom to kind of compare my academic journey, my academic research in leadership with my interpersonal experience with leadership and my experience as a consultant with leadership, once I finally allowed myself to sort of merge those two worlds, this book just came to be, which was fantastic. We talked about intercultural competence. We talked about 5 key mindsets, and I separate those mindsets from skills because mindsets are ways of believing, ways of making sense of the world. And then skills are different. And so in my book, I discuss 5 different mindsets and then 7 different skills or competencies. The skills and competencies one we did recently. And of course, some of you may know I have a love-hate relationship with acronyms. But when I looked at all of the different literature and research on emotionally intelligent leadership that was out there and compared it with a lot of what I've heard from my own clients over the last 10 to 20 years, the list sort of materialized and it almost formed a perfect acronym. And so I just had to, I really dislike it when folks sort of squeeze concepts or change concepts to fit an acronym, but mine was so close that I didn't have to do much squeezing or changing. So today's session is going to be a little bit brief, in part because I have some more business after this webinar I've got to get to. But today it's about how to be strategic in your team's leadership development. And so I have worked in various different sectors. I worked in finance. I worked in hospitality management. I worked in sales. I worked in higher education. And I've also done all kinds of other work. But different industries have different feels and different senses of what it means to be strategic. And the industry that I felt had the best grasp on really doing effective strategic planning and strategic leadership development was the higher education industry. And I guess part of it's because it's an industry full of people who, who do research for a living, right? And so those folks might be a little more inclined. And then also colleges and universities have their own what are called accrediting bodies. The U.S. is unique in this regard because in most other countries, their federal government determines which colleges and universities can and can't give degrees. And the United States system is distinctly different than that. We have regional accrediting bodies, and those regional accrediting bodies are us accrediting ourselves. It's bright minds who volunteer, who work at colleges and universities, and they volunteer to then scrutinize and look at what other colleges and universities are doing, and then they accredit them and they evaluate them on a lot of different things. And so when I was in that industry, the idea that you're sort of measuring what you're doing and the effectiveness of it was critical, right? Whether you were teaching a first-year English class and trying to make the case that that's a worthwhile thing to do. And so you're using data from tests and papers and things. You're using data across lots of different professors. Or if you run the residence halls on campus and you're trying to get data on how effectively you're distributing literature about emergency evacuation plans or something like that. If you run the college infirmary, you may have a measure that has to do with what percentage of your students got their vaccine information in on time or whatever the case is, right? And so in higher ed, we often called it assessment. Assessment's different than research in so much as research is designed to study a phenomenon for the purpose of adding to the understanding, adding to the knowledge base of that phenomenon for the world, for the academic world, right? So if I were to study, for example, the experience of first-gen autistic students at predominantly white public universities in my state and their experiences with their career development centers, right? That's very specific. Using that specificity of language allows me to use a certain kind of way of assessing things that we call research, right? That research has to get through a certain amount of scrutiny in terms of how you do the research. And we're going to talk about this in just a second. And it's going to get a lot less academic. Bear with me, like 2 minutes. But when you're doing research, there's a lot of scrutiny about your methodology, how you're doing the research. Is it ethical? Does it actually measure what you're hoping to measure, and all of those things? So that's research. Assessment is different, and I love assessment. And I personally, I didn't love doing research much, but I love doing assessment, because research, at the end of the day, you publish a paper that you hope someone somewhere will pick up and take the next logical phase of the academic exploration. And you've found out something about a population, you found out something about a phenomenon, and they're going to build more information by doing another study. And so it's a study on top of a study on top of a study to broaden our knowledge, which is awesome. But assessment is measuring stuff that you can turn into change within your organization. Assessment, different than research, doesn't have to go through quite the same scrutiny in terms of ethical research practices and this and that. It's a different bar, a different standard, simply because you're not going to get it published in some national journal. You work at a college, or you work at a nonprofit, or you work at a bank, and you want to assess something that's happening right there in that setting, just to make that practice better, right? So the idea behind assessment, which is a huge part of this being strategic in your leadership development goals, assessment means I'm asking the right questions to help us get better at what we do. I'm not asking questions to help us build foundational knowledge for our field. I'm getting knowledge and data from some kind of source that we're assessing. I'm getting that knowledge in a way that's going to help us do what we do better. And if what we do better is provide financial services because we're a bank, great. If it's educate young adults and we're a college, great. If it's decrease wait times and we are an urgent care center, great. So again, the bottom line is the point of assessment, which is one of the bedrocks of being strategic in your team's leadership development, is that. So let me get into the slides a little bit here, and bear with me as I've got my Google Crowd and my my LinkedIn crowd. So this is, when it comes to being strategic, it's helpful to start with the outcomes in mind. And so your organization may already have defined learning outcomes. Your organization may already have a top 8 list, a top 10 list, a top 12 list, or lists of leadership competencies that you hope your leaders have. Now, you might not have that list. And if you don't have that list, there's a lot of great resources out there. I think my book is one great resource, but there are other great resources as well, where you could cultivate that list of what are the leadership competencies we want for our organization, right? You see my list from my book here: listening, empathy, awareness, development, intercultural competence, navigation of emotional expectations, and the growth mindset. So this is a set of good outcomes. Some of these outcomes are trickier to measure than others, right? Awareness, when you think about awareness, the third bullet point there, self-awareness in particular, it's sort of asking someone how self-aware they are on a survey is going to be pointless in a sense, right? Because those who have an increased level of self-awareness might rate themselves lower, and those who are not very self-aware might rate themselves higher. And so measuring self-awareness is tricky, because self-awareness is about someone self-reporting on one of their own competencies. And that can be unreliable, and it can be tricky, right? One of the examples I use is that if somebody set up an assessment, and the assessment was meant to measure how good of a dancer, singer, and driver I am, if it's a self-report instrument where I'm filling it out, I think I'm a great driver, a great singer, and a great dancer. I think objectively, only one of those three is true. And so self-reporting has a limit, right? But the important thing is that start with your outcomes in mind. You want to think about, what are the outcomes that we hope our leaders are growing in? What are the skills we hope they're growing in? Are there sort of primary competencies and secondary competencies? Does your organization have certain things that you know your organization needs that are fundamental, everyone agrees on, and then sort of stretch leadership goals, right? Things where you can build more. So, for example, when I'm looking at my list, listening, I think it might be one of those fundamental ones. Navigation of emotional expectations, growth mindset. But then other ones, awareness, like awareness of self and others, intercultural competence. These are ones that I think are just as critical, but that you might want to set up sort of a framework for to stretch out that assessment in a way to recognize that that might be a those skills in particular might take more development, right? So are there primary ones or secondary ones? Are there industry specific competencies? So many different industries. My wife's a school counselor, and they have a set of competencies in student affairs, which is what I used to work in higher ed. Student affairs, different areas had specific competencies. If you worked with fraternity and sorority life, for example, you might need to have increased knowledge and industry specific competencies around around the law on campus, around legal outcomes, around you know different aspects of what a fraternity or sorority might run into. That might be different than industry specific competencies at your college infirmary, which probably has to do with physician assistants getting their continuing education credits, nurses getting their continuing education credits. So industry specific competencies. I'm speaking at SHRM this summer, and SHRM has a certification, and you can get and so when you're providing an in-service or workshop, if you fit the right criteria, it can be used for those industry specific competencies, right? So the number one thing you got to start with is what does your team or your organization want out of leaders generally? Is that list sort of a primary set and a secondary set? And are there industry specific things that you need? Keep in mind that in some organizations, industry specific, you could have 5 industries represented within your organization. I'm working with an organization now that has people that do mechanical work and chemistry work and managerial work and sales work, right? So these are different teams, all part of the same organization. And the sales folks might have some very industry specific sales competencies that are different from the chemists, right? So one thing to think about is depending on the size of your organization. Now, a lot of the organizations I work with are sort of mid-size. With colleges and universities, sometimes they are larger ones, but a lot of the companies I work with are sort of mid-sized organizations where they might have 4 or 5 robust departments that each have sort of industry-specific norms and competencies, right? So the first thing is you got to establish that. You and your organization have to put those on paper. Put them on paper, and as you're putting them on paper, you want to think about how you could measure them. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this. One of the things that a lot of organizations do is they'll do assessment. They'll do an annual assessment or a biannual assessment. Sometimes they'll do a 360 assessment with a consulting company or something like that. And but they don't have a plan at the beginning of how to use the data. Like they're going to get these survey results, perhaps if it's a survey, or focus group results if it's a focus group, or however they're collecting the information as they're trying to be strategic. Has your organization thought ahead of time about, once we have this data, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? Trust me when I say many organizations have data sitting on a shelf, so to speak. And when I say a shelf, I mean in a Google Drive or a Teams Drive or something like that. But many organizations do assessments, but they're so busy doing their work that they have not used the results of the assessment to go anywhere meaningful, to do anything meaningful. And so this is an important thing to do at the beginning, right? Because if you can articulate as an organization, what are we going to use the information from this strategic assessment? What are we going to use that information to do? What are we going to use that information for? That can help you shape what you're asking about and how you're asking it. So I'm going to say that one more time. If you have a clear picture as an organization of what you're going to use the data for as you're measuring the leadership growth of your leaders, for example, or measuring anything in your organization, it's not just about getting the right questions. It's not just about measuring the right leadership competencies or other competencies. It's also about, can I ask the questions in a way that's going to make sense when we need to use this data for action, right? So doing this at the beginning is huge. So having that conversation with your team, with your management, and some examples is the data part of an individualized leadership plan. Some people call it an IDP, individualized development plan. I think IDP in some HR circles has sort of a negative connotation, like you've sort of been called to the principal's office, or, that you have behavior that needs correcting, right? Individualized development plan, i.e., you've violated company policy once or twice, or you've been late a few times or whatever, and they put you on an individualized development plan to correct your behavior. An individualized leadership plan, at least the way that I conceive of it and the way that my team and I use it, an individualized leadership plan is something that's not reactive, but it's proactive, right? The idea is that we should all be and bear with me just a second. My battery is low on my laptop. Don't want to lose my people. Bear with me just a second, everybody. Google Meet friends. If I lose you for a second, I will be right back on. LinkedIn friends, thanks for bearing with me on the technology. And I think I can do this seamlessly, I believe. Great. Okay. So individualized development plan versus individualized leadership plan is what I was talking about. Many corporations, organizations, nonprofits, education sector entities do an individualized development plan as sort of a punitive measure or a corrective measure. An individualized leadership plan is different. It's proactive. It is how can you invest in your leaders to help them build their skills. Well, getting data from an assessment or from several assessments is critical in that. And if you're thinking we are going to use this data for an individualized leadership plan, that can shape how you ask the questions and what questions you're asking. Is your organization going to use the data in aggregate, right? Are you going to conduct a survey with all 40 managers in your organization, or all 80 managers in your organization, or the mid-level management team, or just the C-suite? You got your 12 vice presidents or your 20 vice presidents or whatever the case is for your organization. And so are you going to look at the data across different people who have responded to the, however you're measuring a survey, a focus group, etc.? Are you going to use this to think about, well, who or what training are we going to bring in, right? Organizationally, not an individualized leadership plan maybe, but we're going to bring in different folks to do training and development work. And we're going to look at all 40 responses of all 40 vice presidents to see where there's a theme of a gap in their training or a gap in their skills that we could bring someone in for. So again, thinking ahead about whether you're going to use data that you collect in a survey on an individualized basis, on a group basis, or some combination is huge, because it can help you shape what you're asking. If there's any questions, I think the chat is open over on the LinkedIn side. If anybody has any comments on the LinkedIn side. On the Google side, you can try to put a comment in. I don't always see those. It's a little tricky, but yeah. So again, when you're thinking about being strategic, going back one slide, you keep the end in mind. Start with the outcomes in mind, right? What are the outcomes you want? But then as you craft those outcomes, as you turn them into questions, surveys, focus groups, etc., be thinking about, well, once we have the information, what are we going to do with it? When I did my dissertation, I studied 3 organizations that did leadership development training internally. And one of my questions was, how do you use assessment data to improve the quality of the program? The truth was there wasn't much of that. There was another form of data that was used, which was satisfaction data, right? So a satisfaction survey is, did you like this training? An assessment is, what did you learn from the training? And so what I found is that some of these organizations definitely wanted to check in on whether their team liked it, but that's not checking as to what they actually learned, right? And so being very intentional about, if we're going to collect information, what are we going to use it for? That can help shape things. And so then the next part is, if if the goal is to measure leadership development, how does one do that? Leadership development is harder to measure than square inches, right? Or some strictly quantifiable measure, because it involves humans, right? That my company's name, Adaptive Challenge Consulting, comes from some writers who talk about the reality that most of our organizational challenges and problems are adaptive challenges, which means there are humans in the mix, and humans are complete entities with feelings and histories and cultures that they all bring to the office with them. And that if we're not understanding that nature of the challenges in our organization, then we're not going to get very far. So measuring leadership development, you're measuring the competencies of people, right? I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but self-reporting instruments can be effective if they're well constructed, but there are some common mistakes. And so a self-reporting instrument, again, my joke is if I took a survey that asked me how good of a singer I was, how good of a dancer I am, and how good of a driver I am, I might report that I'm good at all three of those. And it's a self-reporting instrument. So it's just my opinion on my skills. There might be other ways to measure my dancing skills, my driving skills, or my singing skills that are more objective, or that are subjective still, involving the opinions of other people, but maybe the opinions of a panel of 40 people that could weigh in, and we could sort of pull that data together. And even though it's still subjective, if there's a big theme like, oh yeah, Alan can sing, right? Or if there's a big theme like, oh wow, he is not a good driver, right? That there are ways to pull together bigger qualitative data to get a little bit of quantitative use out of it, not in an academic research way, but in an assessment way. But there are some pitfalls. There are some mistakes that people make when creating surveys, lacking specificity in language. Sometimes somebody will say, a scale of 1 to 5, rate how much of a team player you are. Okay, well, team player can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? That could be a very culturally bound thing. In my culture, I have a picture of what I think team player means, but what does it mean more specifically? So sometimes overly broad language. Compound questions. This is one of the ones I see with organizations all the time. So a compound question might be like, maybe you're asking a team about their supervisor, and you're asking the team, how effective is your supervisor at listening and giving feedback? So listening is one skill, giving feedback is a different skill. And if I think my supervisor is good at listening and bad at giving feedback, how do I answer that one question, right? Those compound questions happen frequently. And because in the mind of the person creating the survey, typically, they are related. And sure, they can be related, but you want to make it easy for your respondents on the survey, the people taking the survey, you want to make it easy for them to answer the question. And so those compound questions, they are everywhere, and that's a common mistake. And then again, as I've sort of mentioned twice now, lack of self-awareness, right? If someone is being asked to evaluate themselves on their own listening skills, they may have an inflated sense of their listening skills that their team does not share, right? And in a little bit, I'm going to tell you about something we do at Adaptive Challenge Consulting. We call it the 10-factor assessment. And the 10-factor assessment addresses this, because what it does is gets managers to complete a survey about themselves, and then it has a parallel survey where those they manage get to assess them as well, and we get to find gaps. But I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But the lack of self-awareness piece, that self-reporting instruments when it comes to skills are at a disadvantage. Now, some of you might know that I do work with the Myers-Briggs, and I really enjoy the Myers-Briggs when it's done correctly. And self-assessment when it comes to preferences, that's a lot easier to measure. I can tell you I have a preference for coffee. I'm not making any kind of claim about how good I am at making coffee, how good I am at drinking coffee, my skill level in selecting coffee. It is not a skill. The Myers-Briggs is not seeking to measure skill. It's seeking to measure preference, which is easy. I can talk about my preferences easily with accuracy. If I say I prefer to sing over dancing, that's fact. You can count on that. If I say I'm a good singer and I'm a good dancer, you should probably fact check those, right? Because I may have an inflated sense of one or the other, right? 360-degree assessments can be effective. And again, I alluded to this a little bit with what we do with the ACC 10-factor. But some pitfalls with those include open-ended questions that are too vague, and then also complaint-based responses, right? So sometimes surveys asked not of managers to self-report, but of those they manage, of their teams, in those survey constructions. I'm saying surveys because that's the most typical mode, but it can also be focus groups, and there are other ways to collect data. But oftentimes, if people don't feel like their leader is great or their manager is great, and they're given an opportunity to do an assessment, and there's an open-ended question that's too open-ended, what could your manager do better? That invites complaint, right? It invites the language of complaint. And to think about how you want to, if you're thinking about how you want to use the assessment data, how you want to use the data from the survey, you're thinking about that ahead of time. And if the thought is, well, we want to collect this so that we can do trainings to get our managers to be more effective, then craft the questions accordingly. So something like, instead of how could your manager improve, say, what's a specific skill that you would like to see your manager develop? What's a specific skill that you would like to see your manager develop? Where you're not just saying how could they improve, because then you're inviting commentary on all the things they're doing wrong, instead of crafting the question into what's a specific skill that you think your leader or manager could improve on, right? So again, even 360-degree assessments where managers and those they manage are both getting to take part in the assessing, and both taking a survey and giving you, whether you're an HR or whether you're a vice president, giving you the data that's going to inform the next training you do, or inform individualized leadership plans, or those kinds of things, that there are ways to craft it to avoid just inviting complaints, right? There are ways to do that. And again, if you're on the LinkedIn side and you have any questions, put them in the comments. On the Google Meet side, I don't know that I can see the comments, but if somebody raises their hand, I think I can see that if you've got a question on the Google slide. And so then, another great way, and I know I've mentioned a lot of having to do with surveys, but focus groups are great. One of the things in research, they're quantitative research methodologies and qualitative ones. And but some of the ones I love the most are what people call mixed methods. And mixed methods, it's a term from research, but it can be used in assessment as well. And a mixed methods approach would be, I'm going to do a survey for all 150 of our team members and all 30 managers, right? We're going to do an assessment where the managers are rating themselves on different leadership competencies. Those they manage are rating themselves and their leaders on some competencies, where we get this information. And then I'm going to take that data, the 100 and however many team members and the 30 managers, I'm going to take that data and I'm going to look at where are the big trend lines. Is there, of the 10 competencies that we sought to measure, are there 2 that jump off the page as ones that as an organization we need work on, that we need to do better at? If there are those 2 or that 1 or that 3, you can get more rich context about what is meant by people around those competencies by doing something called a focus group. In research circles, the most ideal way is if you have 150 team members to use a random number generator and generate an actually random sample of 150 people. And with statistics, there are all these, if you want to measure 150 people, it's like, well, you have to get at least 35 people to respond from a truly randomized sample or something like that. I don't know. Those numbers are probably not accurate. It's been a long time since I've done quantitative research. But the bottom line is that there is a threshold for any number of people that you're seeking to measure quantitatively of how many participants would you need to get so that you could count on what that smaller group of participants are saying would be generalizable, that it reflects the sort of overall feeling. And again, this is something that's done in quantitative research. It's not perfect, but there are certain thresholds. That said, in assessment world, when you're just trying to measure how effective your leaders are and use that to shape their individualized leadership plan, use that to think about what trainers you're going to bring in, when you're doing it in that way, that statistical thing isn't as critical, but it is fair to say that you need to make a decision for your organization on how many people could you get in the focus group. Could you invite a group that is truly random? And if you can invite a group that's truly random, that will strengthen the confidence you can have in their responses, that their responses would be reflective of the larger group, right? But running focus groups is its own art form. And so there are some mistakes that people make when doing. Just to put a cap on that last part, the mixed method approach is I have that data from that original survey that suggests that these are the two competencies that our organization needs more work on. And now I'm going to do 3 focus groups where I'm going to bribe my team with pizza. I'm going to get a random set of, get a random number generator and randomly invite 20 random people of my 150 to each of the 3 nights, hoping that of those 20, at least 15 will show up. And that means we'd have 45 people in focus groups from a group of about 150, so that you can get a well-rounded understanding of more nuance and context about the ways that the team is thinking about those leadership competencies. So those leadership competencies, when you're doing it on a survey, a lot of times it's on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, something like that. A Likert scale. For years I called it a Likert scale, and then I found out that the person's name was pronounced Likert, and I'm trying to get in that habit, which is weird because I like to say Likert scale. But those things where it's a 1 to 5 scale, 1 to 4 scale, 1 to 10 scale, whatever the scale is, that can tell you kind of a ranking of where people are on measuring a leadership competency, but it can't tell you any more than that. It can't tell you more about why that leadership competency is important, why they are only giving a 4 and not a 5. Now, you can ask those follow-up questions after a Likert scale, but a focus group allows you to delve more deeply. So, but some mistakes that people make is leading questions, right? The questioner, if you're running the focus group, you need to really, really check your assumptions, your cultural lenses, your biases. You need to really, really check that stuff to not ask leading questions. Even when you sense a theme is coming up, it's human nature to sort of follow that. But if you follow it with certain phrases and words, your words might shape what the people in the focus group are, the way they're talking about their experience. So there are ways to be careful about that. Assumptions, I sort of mentioned. Poorly framed prompts, right, where you're asking, like, what could we do to work on this better? Well, that's a pretty broad prompt, right? Whereas a more specific prompt of what's opportunities do you think you might want to do to develop these skills or competencies, right? So not asking someone who's maybe not in management, maybe not in the C-suite, not a VP, asking them to sort of think organizationally about what we could do. That's a pretty tall order for people that might not think that way normally. But if you ask them, well, if these are skills that we know that our organization wants to develop better, what are there conferences, are there books, are there courses that you would want to take to build those skills for you and or people that you work closely with? And then ineffective follow-up. A lot of times people will give an answer, and there are great techniques. I teach this a lot when I'm teaching leaders to do active listening. But the counseling field, which I'm sort of counseling adjacent, is great at modeling active listening and open-ended questions that aren't leading, but that reflect back what the person is actually saying in the focus group, and then ask them to provide more depth and context without taking that depth or context in a certain way. So let me see if I can come up with an example off the top of my head. If the focus group is, say, for example, our survey was on what kind of ice cream we should be serving at the company cafeteria. And we find out that there is a big push for chocolate things in general. And then you get in the room, and then and so you're following up with this aggregate data where the 2 big areas where people wanted more were both chocolate-ish ice creams. So you're like, well, let's do a focus group so we can delve more deeply into the chocolate thing, right? And how we need more chocolate options, this, that, and the other. And somebody in the group says, well, when I answered that, I was only thinking about Rocky Road, and Rocky Road happens to be chocolate, but I don't think it fits categorically in chocolate. And then if you say, well, tell me more about Rocky Road. So what you're doing is or tell me more about why you like Rocky Road. You're sort of getting narrower with your question, when the real question is a question might be more like, tell me more about why that was your choice, because that might unpack not just why do you like Rocky Road. I'm taking what they've already said on the survey and I'm narrowing it for them, but I don't have to. I can leave it broader. Tell me more about why you picked that number, and tell me more about your thinking that you just articulated about Rocky Road. Tell me more about your thinking is broader than why do you like Rocky Road, which is I got to defend why I like Rocky Road. Tell me more about your thinking is going to unveil more things that are going to be more useful for you for your goals. So again, even focus groups, which I think are great when you've got data from a quantitative survey and then do the extra phase of doing focus groups, you can compare that data together, and that can really, really help you think about leadership trainings that you want your teams to do, books that you want them to read together, courses that you want them to take together, etc. So I've alluded to this a little bit, but because because I've worked with so many organizations where they give me their surveys that they're using, and I look at their surveys and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of compound questions here. There's a lot of assumptions built into the survey. Some of them are cultural assumptions. One organization I was working with is working with how to teach more effective public presenting. So this is an educational institution, and they're working on how do they teach their students how to be better public presenters, public speakers, or other modes of public presenting. And one of the, I think, survey questions that they had been kicking around was something like, how do you avoid negative negative body language, or how do you avoid negative nonverbal cues, or something like that. And so that phrase, negative nonverbal cues or negative body language, the word, I don't know, that group didn't necessarily say, and we define negative body language as this, or negative nonverbals as this. And I said to the group, I said, could that be culturally bound? Could what is negative and what is positive body language differ by culture? Could it differ by culture? So they were struggling with that, and I said, well, is what you're asking about positive or negative, or if the goal and purpose is effective presenting, maybe what you're trying to ask is there distracting body language, distracting nonverbals? Because if what you're trying to measure is the effectiveness of communicating from someone on a stage to someone in an audience, and if effectiveness of communication is what you're trying to measure, and to someone in the audience, a certain kind of body language is good, and to the speaker, that same sort of body language is bad, and your measure and the measure you're trying to use is good or bad body language. What if it was just about distracting? Because distracting says to the speaker, you have to be conscious of your audience and conscious of the person in your audience and what might be distracting for them. So it's directional intentionally. It's couched in that way. And so those kinds of things where organizations are trying to measure things. Another organization I worked with had a lot of compound questions in how they ask things. And I get it. If you don't work in surveys, if you don't work in assessment, then saying something like, how effective, I think my example earlier was, how effective is your boss at listening and providing constructive feedback? And again, what if the answer is different for the two different parts of that question? And still, to get to the next page of the survey, I got to click a 1 through 5. And so your data is going to be messed up. Your data is not going to be good for you, because you might look at the data, and a lot of times when I'm faced with those things on a compound survey, and I'm like, and the survey is like, how much did you like the soup and the entree? And if I'm like, if the soup was a 5 out of 5 and the entree was a 3 out of 5, I'm going to put 4. And so anybody looking at that survey would think that both the soup and the entree got a 4. But that's not true. The soup got a 5 and the entree got a 3. And they're not going to be able to make better entrees if they think, oh, well, our entrees are all at a 4. We're good. So those compound questions can really, really mess up your data in a way that's not going to help your organization, right? So the ACC 10 factor, I developed this actually for a client about 4 years ago and have honed it since then. But they were struggling with how to measure their leadership effectiveness. And so a few of the things that make this one pretty cool, that part of why I love this, is it's all about gap identification, right? And so if you are asking 20 people to rate their supervisor on how effective that person is at communicating team goals, how effective is your supervisor at communicating team goals, those 20 people get to weigh in on that. Then that supervisor in the ACC 10 factor also takes a parallel survey where they are asked the same question: rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 on how effective you think you are at communicating team goals. And then my team and I, we get to look at the gaps. And that is the most fun and exciting part, because we're finding those gaps on an individual basis, and we're finding those gaps in sort of a department basis, or a company basis, or a nonprofit basis, or university basis, etc. So finding the gaps is important. But the other thing that we use for the ACC 10 factor, and this is different from a lot of different assessments, is that we actually get the folks to complete a personality assessment based on Jungian psychology. So the most famous Jungian assessments, the Myers-Briggs, we use one that's slightly different, but it's based on Jungian typology. And the reason that that's important is because once we understand the personalities of each person responding, we can get more flavor and more depth in the data, and we can be aware of how, no matter how well constructed the questions are, some of them are going to have a cultural or a, sort of a bias one way or the other. So let me give you an example. An example would be if I went back to that one about how effective is your manager at communicating team goals. Okay, if you're a manager, and if you're not familiar with Jungian typology or the Myers-Briggs, the first dichotomy is extrovert and introvert. People with extrovert preferences tend to be more outgoing, verbally process externally a lot of what they think. People with introvert preferences tend to process more internally. Will still process externally, but after ideas have been honed and formed, and might be less talkative or perceived as less talkative than their extroverted counterparts. So if we're asking 20 members of a team, how effective is your supervisor at communicating team goals? And that supervisor happens to be a person with an introvert preference. And of the 20 people responding, 17 of them are people with extrovert preferences. Before the survey even happens, I already know that on that particular vector, on that particular factor within the 10 factors, that one is going to be a little bit skewed based on personality. That overwhelmingly, if your team is 17 people with extrovert preferences and they have a manager or a leader who has introvert preferences, that question is automatically going to, the gap is going to be bigger than it would be if those things were in a vacuum. I hope that makes sense. And so there are other parts of Jungian typology that we're able to look at. And so where, as I'm looking for these gaps, right? And a lot of times when it's in perfect agreement, right? When we're talking about supervisor, it's like rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 when it comes to your intercultural competence. And the supervisor gives themselves a 4 and their team all gives them a 4. That is great. I don't need to dig any more deeply. But then sometimes if we're asking about something about when your supervisor gives feedback, is it specific feedback? Is it specific feedback? The second letter of the Myers-Briggs, sensing and intuition, that is how we all like to absorb knowledge. And so everyone taking the survey either has sort of an inclination towards specificity in how they want to receive knowledge, or an inclination into context and less specificity in how they absorb knowledge. And me knowing that can help me find where that data might be a little misleading. So this is the reason I love this. And I wish I as powerful as this tool is, I wish I knew how to sell it more effectively. I mean, I guess at this webinar, I'm sort of hyping it up in a way, but I wish I knew how to sell it more effectively. And for us, when we use it, we either our team or we work in partnership with the organization to craft those individualized leadership plans. And again, the individualized leadership plans are meant to be growth and development focused and not punitive, not corrective, right? And I understand that in many different settings, the only time an individualized plan shows up is when it's time to be corrective. But by that point, it's a little late in the game. What if we could do this proactive leadership development work ahead of time? And that individualized leadership plan, the other thing that I love about that when I craft those is I take their Jungian type and I craft their plan in a way that's going to make most sense for their type. I hope that makes sense. So in other words, going back to the introvert extrovert dichotomy, if I know someone has an introvert preference, as I start talking to them about the different goals that they should be crafting on their individualized leadership plan, one of the goals that I'm going to say is I know that people with introvert preferences over their lifetime, it takes time for them to develop the willingness to process externally during brainstorming time, because many people with introvert preferences want to hone their ideas fully before saying them, and brainstorms is sort of like what is everybody's ragged thoughts, what is everybody's raw ideas, and people with introvert preferences aren't wired with that preference. That doesn't fit their preference, right? So I can go ahead and say, well, I can tell from your type that this is going to be an area of ongoing development for you. And in the 10 factor, we found that there was a gap here or a gap there. And so these things support each other. And so I can use that to help you more effectively make a plan. But then even the way I communicate their individualized leadership plan to them, first of all, it's done collaboratively with them articulating some of their goals, me looking at the gaps, and then me looking at everybody's type and putting it together that way. But then, even how I communicate it to them is trying to fit their type. The different types some types will want a bullet point to-do list to work on a skill. And some types will want a set of resources for them to find on their own time to develop that skill. And the fact that I am certified in Myers-Briggs and have a nuanced understanding of which types have which preference for how they receive leadership instruction, how they receive information about how they can develop it as leaders, I can speak directly to them through their type in a way that's going to get them further. So that's one of the things I love about this. And again, I wish that I was a more effective salesperson at getting the word out on this thing, because it's a really, really powerful tool because we're using these different layers. And then the last thing I'll say about the ACC 10 factor is the one thing I love when we find what I call the humility gaps. And this happens a lot. And so, for example, with the intercultural one, this comes up a fair amount, where a leader or a manager, when asked about how interculturally competent they are, sometimes they'll give themselves a 2. And interestingly, leaders who rate themselves lower on intercultural competence are generally rated, in my experience with groups I've worked with, are generally rated higher by those they supervise on that same factor. And what that suggests to me is that part of intercultural competence is humility about your level of intercultural competence, right? Can you prove you're interculturally competent by bragging about your intercultural competence? Or can you prove you're interculturally competent by saying, I have more work to do. I need to understand other cultures more. I need to understand my own culture more, etc. And I'm going to give myself a 2. And my team knows that I'm oriented that way, and they give me a 4. And I love seeing the humility gaps because as much time as we spend trying to correct the behavior of ineffective leaders and bad leaders, and as much as bad leaders and ineffective leaders cost organizations lots of money through losing talented people that don't want to work for bad managers, through ineffective practices, through training and retraining, and through punitive measures and all these things that cost money to do, it is encouraging when I see those leaders that have those humility gaps. And again, the last part here is that this is about being proactive. Some organizations I work with sometimes ask us to do coaching on folks that need sort of corrective action, and we can do that, but the best organizations are leading into individualized leadership plans well before there's a problem that needs correcting. So thank you all. It's 12:48. I knew this one was going to be a little bit shorter than normal, but thank you all for joining on the Google side, on the LinkedIn side. If you haven't gotten a copy of my book yet, get a copy of my book. The course, actually, hold on. I'm going to tell you, don't buy the book or the course right now. In I think Friday or Saturday, there's going to be a book course combo where instead of $20 and $40, which together, if my math is right, is $60, you're going to be able to get both of them, I think, for $50. So if you want to get a copy of my book, or if you want to take my course, make a little note to get it Saturday, because by Saturday the combo will be up and you can save a little bit of money. But the course delves deeply into Jungian typology and how that can make us more emotionally intelligent leaders. And then Leading with Emotional Intelligence, the book, is a broader view that does include parts about Jungian psychology, but also includes a lot about intercultural competence. And then also just what are the key skills that emotionally intelligent leaders need. So thank you for joining me for my webinar. This is the last in this series. If you're not following Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn yet, follow Adaptive Challenge Consulting on LinkedIn so that you can find out when our next webinars will be coming up. Otherwise, everybody have an amazing Thursday. Take care.